bring those types of cases, thought the courts back then. And the bad news, of course, is that the last exception has been chipped away at in recent years, and now it's incredibly difficult to bring these sorts of challenges under the establishment clause. And so there were a number of cases that got us there. One example is the Valley Forge Christian College case versus Americans United for Church and State, where a portion of land from a closed army hospital was given to a Christian college, and Americans United sued. In a split Supreme Court, surprisingly ruled that AU didn't have standing to bring this case because the gift was made without a regard to a decision by Congress, as if that seemed to have some bearing on this thing. They said it was just an action by a government agency and it didn't impact the taxing and spending power of government. So, as more conservative justices were added to the bench, our likely success in this area went downhill. And indeed, in 2007, the court denied taxpayer standing to Freedom from Religion Foundation and to any future taxpayers challenging the federal funds to support executive branch government actions. Now, on our side, Justice Souter argued in his dissent that when an executive agency spends identifiable sums of tax money for religious purposes, no less than when Congress authorizes the same thing, taxpayers suffer injury. But who knows how long it'll be before Souter's opinion prevails, given what we see in the federal courts today. Let's see. Also, another little development that I think is worth mentioning. In 2005, the court ruled in Cutter v. Wilkinson that there could be more religious exemptions to secular rules. And I call these special rights for the religious, because they allow religious people to opt out of the rules. Can you think of examples where special rights are given to the religious to accept them from the rules that we normally would live by? Daycare. Others? Where vaccinations, wearing special hats and photos, and bringing, perhaps in some states, bringing a little dagger to school with you if you're Sikh. There's lots of exceptions to the rules that exist for all sorts of folks. And, well, in Cutter v. Wilkinson case made it worse, because it used to be that the burden was on the individual to prove that the state was limiting their religious liberty. Now, the individual was assumed correct, and the government had the burden of proving that the exception that was being requested made a problem for the state. So you can see how that really shifted the dynamic considerably, and the ruling's now being used by the religious right to argue for all sorts of special religious rights. During this period, the court also upheld vouchers for religious schools, allowed schools to participate in federal aid programs that were religious, allowed public school teachers to be sent mandatorily into religious schools for teaching projects. And on top of that, the federal courts recently concluded that in God we trust is not a problem on our currency, in government buildings, or as a national model. In fact, our losing record is so bad that our friends are becoming wary of helping us. A former board member of the National ACLU confided in us, in me actually, that they are taking less than 10% of the church-state separation cases that they used to. And our Jewish and interfaith friends have nearly left the field in helping us. And Americans United for Separation of Church and State is reasonably arguing that we use extreme caution so that we don't create more bad precedent. For those of you who don't know how that process works, if we bring a piece of legislation like Darwin Day resolution every year to Congress and suggest that they should pass it so that we support sound science education instead of intelligent design and the like, every year we bring it, we have a better chance of success. We can keep doing it on and on without any problems. But with a court case, if you lose that case, you set a precedent, you can't bring it again. It's a problem. So that creates the situation that we're in today. And it sounds like we need to develop new strategies like the religious right did in the 70s and 80s. And the good news is we did. We have a plan. Anyone remember how same-sex marriage first became legal in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Ohio, a few other places? They used the courts, and they used the courts in a particular way. It was argued that a prohibition on same-sex unions violated gay and lesbian couples' right to equal protection under the law, as stated in the state constitution. And there are two key elements here. First, the basis was equal protection argument, which is enshrined in the US Constitution's 14th Amendment and ensures that all groups get equal protection under the government for their rights. And in this case, that was same-sex couples deserving the same protection as that of opposite-sex couples. The second key element of this success was it was in the state courts, smartly steering clear of those federal courts that we've been talking about earlier. And it was possible to keep the battle in the states because almost every state has a equal protection clause like that in the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution in their state constitution. And if you bring it under the state constitution, it can't go into the federal courts. Very clever process that was developed, and we can do the same thing in protecting the rights of humanists, atheists, and other freethinkers. This seemingly obvious approach hasn't ever been tried before, perhaps because our movement didn't see itself as a group that was united and worthy of equal protection. But our legal coordinator, Bill Burgess, and our team of pro bono attorneys all around the country are convinced that this will be the critical factor to our future success. And there's plenty of support for this in the case law. A court said back in 1994, just as government cannot segregate people on account of their race, so too it may not segregate on the basis of religion. And they said, a government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts God prefers some. So, the Establishment Clause taxpayer standing dilemma that we talked about a little bit is not the same kind of problem here either, because proof of injury is satisfied by the unequal treatment itself, because religious discrimination is presumptively unconstitutional, meaning the government would have to show a compelling reason for any unequal treatment. So here, what needs to be proven is just the unequal treatment or discrimination against the person's group, in our case, non-theists. When the government provides a benefit to one group, religious citizens, by erecting a religious monument on public land, it makes the excluded group feel less important or second class to the majority. So, it has an advantage of the old sponsorship of religion cases too, by the way, because it presents the argument as direct discrimination. We're not talking about an abstract concept in the Constitution that some people get, some people don't. Church-state separation sounds really easy for folks in our movement to understand, but as we know, unfortunately, the general public doesn't always agree. But this is basic and straightforward. We're being discriminated against. It needs to end. So, we've identified a handful of states where we're going to test this theory and strategy, the first of which is Massachusetts, where we filed our case against Under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. And our past president, who I believe was here recently, David Niosi, is personally arguing this case. And he's showing that utilizing Under God language in daily patriotic ceremonies in Massachusetts public schools results in three problems. First, by even doing it in the first place, it creates a situation where there's prejudice against the group, because daily affirming to children in a patriotic context that the country is under God is obviously opposed to what we view. Second, it creates this situation where kids are stuck. They have a no-win situation. They either participate in the pledge and affirm this prejudice against themselves, or they don't participate in the pledge, don't get to participate in the patriotic exercise, and risk ostracizing themselves from their peers. It's not what we want to see happen. And so in this case, we handily brushed past the defending school district's motion to dismiss, and in writing our case had merit to be heard, the first judge reiterated our position, saying that the state would have to have a compelling reason to act in a way that discriminates on this religious question. She went on to say that participation in a ceremony with those reciting Under God falsely creates a sense of social unanimity with regard to this religious affirmation. The next judge in the district court level wasn't quite as brave as the first, and tried to get the case sidelined on some formality, but we appealed, fixing our argument, and were quickly considered, and I forget the legal term for this, but it was jumped up to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, where they're going to be hearing that in September. So I think that this new strategy doesn't just apply to Under God cases either, by the way. it could be useful for many church-state separation arguments taken from the non-theistic perspective. And so while the religious right is arguing that separation of church and state is not a concept that can be found in the Constitution, we're trying to bring the concept of atheist humanistic equality into the US legal scene. And with it, we aimed to stand up for our rights, and as well as all Americans, to believe or not believe as they see fit. Thank you. So, I'd be happy to chat some more about our legal work or other work that we're up to.
Besides Massachusetts, what are the other states?
That's a good question. We brought the case in Massachusetts first because of the success of that same-sex marriage case, which was the first one to win. But then we did an analysis of all the states as to their likelihood of success in the courts based on the climate of the courts as well as the state constitutions. And it turns out that New Jersey is the best state in the country. And that the next best one is actually Montana and Hawaii. And then, unfortunately, North Carolina is not too high. I'm sure that comes as a shock.
Louisiana was kind of up there. We were surprised about.
It's true. Yeah. Just the nature of the situation there. Yeah. Go ahead.
What can individuals do at the local level to help out?
Well, keep an eye out for cases. We are definitely looking forward to taking more cases of this sort, not just on the under God question, but on other ones. For instance, I don't know if you talked about the Mississippi Assembly, but for those of you who know, there was an assembly, a Christian-only Learn to Come to Jesus type assembly in Mississippi recently, and they did it for each grade level, and what happened is the student in there wanted to leave the room and not hear this assembly, and they told her and a few other students to go back and sit down and watch it. So it was mandatory by any way to think of it. And then they were going to do it for the other grades. And so that student contacted us and said, please intervene. And so we called the school and told them that they can't do that. That's against the rules. And they said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so they did it for the other grades as well. And we sued. And so for some reason, they haven't backed down just yet, but they are sure to lose this one. This one is a very solid case where they've mandatorily suggested that their students be exposed to even more than prayer. It's evangelical. It's absolutely evangelical video presentation. But we love to get involved in these sorts of cases in other places because we have an expanding team of lawyers who are ready to go and know that this is something that we need to get involved in.
Speaking of a team of lawyers, do you have a resource list for us in North Carolina?
Resource list.
Like a list of lawyers that we need to contact?
Oh, well, we do have a couple lawyers who are on our team in North Carolina. I don't think either one of them are Charlotte-based, but we can help. And what would happen is, if something happened or that you're aware of a violation, we would seek support from somebody locally. And if we couldn't find one and the case was very strong, we would simply hire an attorney to allow us to represent directly from DC, which we've done in a couple of places. And that's worked really well. In fact, we're doing that in California, where in a part of California, we don't have a lawyer, where they have an interesting case, kind of surprising for California, where they want to put up a monument, a memorial for veterans. And on the memorial, there is a picture of a veteran on his knees praying to a large cross. And so they didn't even build this yet. And we said, look, you can't do that. You know, that's against the rules. That's clearly religious, I think. And they wouldn't back out, so we're going all the way with that one, too. Right, yeah, I think the interesting thing there, there's a number of types of cases that I think this one falls into, where there's after-school programs, there's use of school facilities for religious services, there's programs where Bibles are being given out at schools, things like that. Of course, from our perspective, we'd like that not to happen. The schools have two options. They make it open to everybody equally, or they don't do it. And we found that in a lot of places, they don't really want to make it open to everybody. And so when they find out that, oh, well, that means we have to allow the gay and lesbian student group to meet and to do this work, and that we need to allow them to deliver literature, and that the Wiccan group gets to deliver stuff, and that the atheist group does, and that they all get an equal amount of space, an equal amount of, well, then they change their mind and they drop the program.
What about the independent churches that are serviced, that provide services at these schools?
Right. So where I'm going with this is that the school has to, it's fine for them to allow churches to use their space for services, if they're allowing the humanist group to do it as well, and they're anybody else, and then they have to figure.
You wouldn't know that necessarily.
Your situation, we'd be happy to look into it, but usually a little pushing on the school will convince them that they can't do it. Another example is they used to put flyers for materials in kids' backpacks. I don't know if your parents, you'll know about that. And then those flyers come sometimes from churches. Well, if they did that, then there's going to be humanist and atheist flyers in there too. And as soon as the school sees that, then they stop the program. So, we just have to kind of be vigilant for those things, because it's not appropriate for them to be proselytizing our kids in schools. I mean, that's just wrong. But the best way to challenge it is to show them that they need to be equal to everybody, is what we found. A couple more. You first.
I think a few months ago there was like a UN resolution that didn't pass that was going to ban blasphemy or something like that. I was just wondering if you do work internationally,
We
anything
do
on
some
that
work
level.
internationally. In fact, Maggie does a lot of that. I don't know if you want to say a few words.
Oh, sure. Well, we actually just started getting involved with the U.S. State Department with regards to atheist discrimination that's happening abroad. Some of us have heard about the Bangladesh bloggers who have been arrested, and some killed actually for what they've been saying online, saying that they don't believe in God. And there are particular cases in Egypt and I think Indonesia where atheists are being arrested. And so we've actually petitioned and had meetings with the U.S. State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom to talk to them about atheist discrimination, because they issue an annual report on behalf of hundreds of minority religious groups, but they've never mentioned atheist discrimination before. They don't actually count it as a protected class under religious freedom, which is what basically we asked them to do last year. So this year we're hoping that actually translates into something in the report. And this report is important because it's used for sanctions against other countries. So that's something that we're doing internationally.
And the first report from their collegial group.
Oh, yeah, so there's
they've already
another,
done it, yeah.
right, this is actually, so there's a State Department, and then there's a group called the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom that's appointed by the President. And this group is another group that we've also been lobbying to recognize atheist discrimination. They just released their first annual report, a couple of weeks ago, and they've mentioned atheist discrimination for the
First time. So they're receptive, I think. The people there want to be heard. I think that we haven't been organized enough to actually utilize the facilities before. And there's been some discrimination, some prejudice among some of the folks in the past. But today, I think the road is getting clearer and clearer for us to be more involved internationally. This blasphemy issue, obviously we want our State Department to not be trying to allow blasphemy initiatives to go through. And that specific item.
So far, it seems you've been reactive. Do you have any plans to be proactive?
Well, I guess it sort of depends on how you look at it. I think of this under God case as very proactive in that we're trying to move forward that envelope of church-state separation that exists today to include more things that it hasn't since, well, many decades at least. But I know what you're saying, and it's true. The religious right had been very powerful in the 1990s, and then through the Moral Majority and Christian Coalition, and then inculcated into government with George W. And they're still there as part of the problem. We have a lot of situations where there are government earmarked funds for all kinds of things that are inappropriately religious. You know, the faith-based initiatives include funding for programs where, for trying to help people who are suffering from addictions, for instance, that require them to give over their selves to Jesus Christ in order to continue with the program. I mean, that's
Higher power.
yeah, and that's taxpayer-based stuff. And so there's so much to fight. It's hard to be on the pro-offense, but we're so much on the defense. It's true. But we look for opportunities like that, definitely. Oh yeah, we do have the Kids Without God website. That was the ad campaign just this last year that Maggie mentioned, pointed to kidswithoutgod.com, where young parents and kids can go on there and find good information for that's the first time that we kind of packaged it, because if we looked out there for information on, you know, if you're a Christian kid or a Jewish kid or a Muslim kid, there are tons of websites and videos that is made for you to learn about your tradition. And there was nothing like that for non-theist kids before, until we did this site. So that could be an example, yeah.
You had mentioned before the avoidance of bad legal precedent as informing a big part of your strategy.
That's right.
I'm curious, and I think that's very prudent. I'm curious if that's part of just the Humanist Association strategy, or if there's been any discussion or agreement with other secular groups.
We're trying to do that. Yeah, I mean, we legal groups are hard to get along. Historically, I think it's because when you bring a lawsuit, you know, there's a plaintiff that's bringing that lawsuit, and that one gets all the press and publicity and things. And so legal groups kind of are secretive amongst each other, and we're trying to bring in ways to try to move our strategy along in a cohesive way. In fact, we'll be meeting in the fall to discuss that as a group. But it's a little bit of a slow process. But you're right, it's something we need to do. If we knew we were all on the same page, we could avoid things like bad precedent in setting cases. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you all.
Definitely, one of the first things you should do is become a member of the AHA if you haven't already. That's very important if you want to help the work that they do. Also, become active and support your local groups. So I know that Charlotte, Atheists, and Agnostics can use some donations. We're trying to bring more speakers in, and not all of them are as generous as Roy and Maggie are here. So we do need to raise some funds if you'd like to see more of this kind of venue and these kind of talks. So thank you very much for coming out. I really appreciate it. We have a table full of really cool stuff over here. A few books left. We have some bumper stickers, some car decals. They're all for sale, and yes, we can take credit cards. Also, if you want to give a donation, do take credit cards. Also, if you're interested, some of us are going to go to a restaurant and or a bar and have some food and drinks to celebrate. So stick around, we'll decide on a place to go if you're interested. Thanks again.